We'll looking at the time, we'll move on. Indeed, as you said, we've next got Lee White. He's the Executive Director at the International Financial Reporting Standards, that's the IFRS Foundation. Lee's in charge of the day-to-day operations of the Foundation, the oversight body of the International Accounting Standards Board, and I think he's going to tell us a bit more about these proposals for a new International Sustainability Standards Board. So over to you, Lee.
Lovely, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for the invitation to participate. I'd also just like to express our appreciation to our previous speaker, Dr. Ma Jung, for all of the excellent work that's happening through that G20 working group. So very much appreciated. So I have a small number of slides that I just wanted to go through, and then obviously spend a little bit of time at the end. Some questions, happy to take one around timing that Dr. Ma Jung and Peter just touched on as well. One thing I should say is things continue to move at really quite a rapid pace, and whilst I've presented these slides to try and keep you up to date as much as I can, I'll also give you a reference at the end to our website where different elements are continuing to be updated. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. And this is really trying to set the context of where the IFRS Foundation has come from, and then in later slides where we're at today, and then looking forward. So in the Q4 of calendar year 2020, the Foundation put out a consultation paper around this form of reporting, and we set it out in a way with some fairly high-level strategic questions. Is there demand for global sustainability standards? And if so, what is the type of role that the IFRS Foundation could play? And certainly in there was the suggestion of this creation of a board. What we heard back through the responses, and again, all this information is on our website, all publicly available, because we had nearly 600 responses. There's a growing and urgent demand for a set of global standards. That we need to make sure that there is better information for investors, and very much to allow a sense of global comparability, prioritising climate but not stopping on climate, and what you might describe as a broad but conditional support for the Foundation to play a role. Thank you. Now, I will spend a little bit of time here because this is very much around the strategic direction that the proposed board will be taking. First and foremost, this was based on the feedback I just referred to. So, investor focused in the standards that would be created, and particularly around enterprise value, that being for the short, medium and longer term. Secondly, that there was very much an encouragement to the trustees not to start with a blank piece of paper. If the board is going to be created, please build on the excellent work that has already been done by a number of the existing initiatives, and we can talk further about that. Equally, we need to make sure that there is an alignment between what you might create globally to what is happening regionally, and Dr. Ma Jung touched on this as well with this phrase of global baseline and building block approach. So goal being internationally to have the global baseline to provide that sense of consistency of reporting and comparability, and then where jurisdictions have a desire to grow further, they're able to do that by adding in or building upon the global baseline. And finally, and to be really clear here, for the proposed board to commence with climate, prioritise climate, but not to only do climate, to look to other aspects of ESG reporting where there would be relevance for investors and also global support. Next slide, please. Now, this slide just gives a greater sense of that element of the baseline, And over on the left-hand side, or the smallest block we could see, and that's not to mean it's the least relevant, but we've got the financial reporting, which has already been undertaken by different standard setters, by certainly the International Accounting Standards Board, housed already within the IFRS Foundation. And therefore we see this connectivity between the sustainability related financial disclosures, the ones that would be produced by the proposed new board, but equally those sitting inside where there may be broader ambition for full sustainability reporting requirements, and those very much coming from jurisdictions or global initiatives which are very much focused on the full remit. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide is really just to give a sense of the type of structuring that the IFRS Foundation currently has in place. We're an organisation with 22 trustees, therefore they have looked to a smaller group of trustees to do very much the strategic direction and project oversight, but clearly all key decisions are taken by the full level of trustees. We have two working groups, one dealing with multilateral work, which is preparatory work on sort of the connectivity between the global baseline and jurisdictional requirements. We've got a technical readiness working group, and that's the one that I referred to earlier about building upon the great work that's already been done. And also the trustees have an independent group, the Eminent Persons Group, and they are there to provide the strategic advice and counsel to the trustees as we move through our next steps of process. Thank you. Now, Dr. Ma Jung spoke very briefly about our governance arrangements and our organisational structure, and I actually find this quite a useful visual. So starting in the middle there, I've referred a number of times to the Foundation's trustees. They're the ones charged with governance, strategy and oversight. There are 22 of those trustees. They oversight the current work on the left-hand red box of the International Accounting Standards Board, and will, if we set this new board up, and I'll talk a little bit further about next steps, oversight also the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board. Now, sitting above the trustees and providing that level of public accountability is the IFRS Foundation Monitoring Board. And that brings together some really quite key public authorities. It's chaired by IOSCO. We also have members from the US SEC, from the European Commission, the Chinese Ministry of Finance, and the Japanese regulator, the FSA. So a great combination of members to deliver that full remit of public accountability. Thank you. So I mentioned things are moving very much on a daily basis, and by coincidence, this presentation today is actually quite critical in terms of days, as we for the last 3 months have been out consulting on our governance and constitutional changes. So in a way, we had the strategy of Q4 last year consultation. This one that closes today, the 29th of July, actually is getting into the real detail about proposed changes to create the new board. A few bullet points there to give you that sense of the types of topics that are covered in those constitutional changes. And might I say also thank you to ISO and to Peter. I know they've also done a submission to these changes as well. So thank you very much for that involvement. And for anyone interested in the all of the responses that happen, they are all publicly available on our website. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now, what I've tried to do in a very brief way is give you the sense of context, but here is a timeline as well. So we start out there, you can see in Q4 of 2020, that was the consultation paper I referred to earlier. You could see through the first and partially into the second quarters, the feedback and the strategic direction that the trustees were taking. That was where I highlighted those 4 particular areas. We also released in Q2 a feedback statement on that first consultation paper, but also the proposed amendments to the Constitution that I just referred to. We're also commenced our search for the chair and vice chair of the proposed board. Here we are in late July. We've done a range of pieces of engagement through different stakeholders, such as this event today. And as well, we are just closing the consultation on the Constitution, and then we'll go straight forward to preparing the feedback analysis in order to then provide that analysis and recommendations to the trustees to direction they may wish to take in terms of the Constitution. Lots more occurring through those working groups I mentioned, and we are all building ideally to possible announcements at COP26 in November of this year, but lots more work still to be done. And if we could go to the final slide, please. Oh, I thought there was one more. My apologies, but I could still cover that quite easily. If you come onto our website, www.ifrs.org, you can register on there quite easily to register your details and then specify what information you may wish to receive. Very much a slider around sustainability, and you can be continued to be updated. And so, for example, last night on our website, we released the latest public notes arising from our trustee meeting on Monday of this week. And that also includes a link to the Canadian Department of Finance, who recently wrote to our trustees encouraging them to consider a location of Canada for the proposed board, and also outlining a level of support they would make to the foundation. So Peter, more than happy to come to Q&A, please.
Thank you very much, Lee. That's very clear. I think delegates will really appreciate that outlet. I'm more than happy to volunteer support for that website. I use that too. It's a very, very easy to use, and I commend it to everyone. I think with the good work that IFRS are doing, it's by far the most effective way of choosing what it is you want to know about and then getting notified. And I think it's a really good example of using modern technology to create more openness and accessibility in terms of the sort of decision-making process. So appreciate that. We got time probably just for a few questions come in. I'm going to turn to this one. You mentioned around the technical readiness working group, which is a great idea to sort of take advantage. I just wondered whether there's anything emerging from perhaps their thinking about how accounting standards can be best integrated with the management and performance standards that are in existence. And a question that I think is on people's sort of lips that follows on from that, is that going to lead to a less complex reporting relationship? Will they end up with perhaps less standard setting organizations? Be interested in your personal views about that.
Let me touch on the last element of your question first, Peter, and then happy to come back. Certainly the trustees, in setting out the desire to create the board, one of the key requirements for success was to see some form of consolidation and less complexity in this space. And that's because there's been many organisations all doing very good work, but with slightly different stakeholder focus. So that goal needs to be satisfied before we would go finally to setting up the new board. Discussions are well underway in order to see how we can do that. And I've got to say, there's been a wonderful spirit of engagement between all of those organisations who are part of the TRWG. The first element was really, I think, a bit more around the interconnectedness between accounting or financial reporting and perhaps what may come through as new standards in this sustainability area. And I've got to say, it's very early stages, but my goodness, it's exciting to hear some of those around those discussions and thinking about how that interconnectedness might take. And for those who might be a little bit like myself as an accountant, or a bit more interested in the financial reporting aspect, just take a topic like intangibles. Intangibles will feature in financial reporting and also feature very much perhaps in the work of the new board. And then the question is, how does that actually, where's the demarcation, or where's the lines drawn? And that's something we would need to work through. But I think the benefit then is for a much better explanation coming whichever way it does around that topic of intangibles. So watch this space is probably the best way to say that, Peter.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. And then you gave us a really good timeline up to COP26, and you obviously got a very tight time schedule for that. But I wonder whether you can just look a bit ahead and give any indication when you think the first sustainability standards might actually emerge from this new ISSB, and what the first ones might cover. Thank you, Peter. And I've got to say, yeah, it is a tight timeline, certainly to COP, but even before what we've been running. So we referred to the TRWG. Part of their work is around a climate-related disclosure, a prototype, and that has been very much the point of focus of that group. And ideally, and I've got to be careful here because I'm part of the foundation, I'm not part of the new board, and we will have decisions being taken by the new board, but all things being equal, that prototype, when we present it to the new board, perhaps at COP26, will actually form the basis perhaps of a very good exposure draft, and then ultimately onto a standard. I get a lot of questions about that timing, so I'm glad that's come through from those listening and engaging today. I think as best we could see it at this stage, it would be a mid-June 2022, perhaps, where that standard could be available, but perhaps even it might be into the Q3 of 2022. I think then the board also concurrently has to turn its attention to where its other priorities lie, and that would happen normally through an agenda consultation, which I suspect would start in early 2022. And then they've also got to think about how to do some provisional transitional work where perhaps the board may want to go into other areas of ESG, but haven't done that as yet, but perhaps some of those members of TRWG have already, and so we might have a look at how to use that work already. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense, but let me reassure everyone here, if the trustees are very much strong on making sure that key message of growing and urgent demand is responded to as swiftly as we can. Brilliant. Thank you, Lee. And I think, you know, we all in the ISO, speaking for the ISO community, we look forward to the really productive sort of discussions to date and continuing on that, because I think we all join in a global endeavor here, and there's plenty to do. We've all got plenty to do. We needn't worry about running out of what each has to do. We just have to work together. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll have to move on now. Bye-bye to Lee.